Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Dale DeCesar, and my colleague Mark Fermanik are happy to talk to you today. And the topic of our webinar is cost effectiveness, cost feasibility, and cost benefit methods in education research. And we've got a lot to talk about today, but we're hoping to kind of make this as interactive as possible. So we have some quizzes and polling type things that we're going to do along the way. And let's see. So Joe, I'm trying to advance the slide here. Okay.
You should just be able to use your arrow keys to go ahead and do that. If you can't, tell me. It looks like you are controlling the screen.
Yeah, it appears to be a little bit of a delay, but we'll go with it. So a little bit about who we are. We are part of the Regional Education Lab for the central region of the country. And as you may know, the labs are overseen by the U.S. Department of Education and IES, the Institute for Education Sciences. And our region covers the 7 states, including Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. And our function is to work with education leaders in this region to identify education issues of the highest importance to state and district leaders, and to conduct rigorous research studies and provide technical assistance to help provide answers to things like what types of interventions are working, to help them use data more effectively. And in our conversation today, to talk about how we can not only provide answers to whether certain interventions are working, but what are the costs associated with those interventions, and what are some of the costs and benefits that people want to consider when choosing among multiple approaches. And Mark and I work for a company called APA Consulting. We're located in Colorado. We've been around since 1983, and we work within REL Central to conduct research and evaluation studies. So Joe, maybe you could advance the next slide because it doesn't seem to be. So the agenda for today, we have kind of 3 major areas that we're going to talk about. The first is just a background of cost analysis in education research in general, and why this is an important topic to think about. The second is we're going to review 3 key cost analysis methods, and just so you all know, we actually are going to have some little hypotheticals that we're going to ask you to actually give your best answer to based on what we've talked about. So a little bit of a quiz, and then to kind of bring this into the real world, we have a study that we just completed for REL Central that was released earlier this year. That was an impact study looking at a teacher mentoring program in Colorado, but also included a rigorous cost analysis and an analysis of the value of some of the benefits that were generated by the program. Next slide, if you could. But first, we kind of wanted to hear from all of you, just if you could use the Q&A function that Joe talked about at the very beginning. Just let us know, what your role is in your organization, and what is their sort of primary interest in learning more about the cost analysis methods. So we'll give you a second to fill that out. Great. We have sort of a mix of folks. So we have some district folks on. We have a teacher specialist who's interested in the advantages and disadvantages of various cost analysis methods. We have a doctoral research student. We have evaluator who's interested in ROI, return on investment studies in general. Education Research Institute looking at cost analysis methods and return on investment for high school programs. So we have a mix of sort of some researchers and some folks out in the field who are kind of, interested in their district, potentially using these kind of analysis in their own research on their own interventions. So that's great. All right, let's go to the next slide. So just as an overview of why we're having this conversation today, as most people know, educators and education leaders right now and policymakers are really operating in restricted fiscal environments where, decisions about how to fund certain programs are at a premium, and there's no room to waste. The education leaders are having to choose between a variety of interventions, many of whom claim to have benefits and impacts on students and teachers, and have different levels of cost associated with them. And they're having to choose among those. And what's the best way of using rigorous research to help make decisions about the best approaches to use? And unfortunately, in traditional education research, even where we have rigorous studies that use comparison groups and experimental designs, many of the studies don't include details on the program cost that they're analyzing. That's just something that has not been emphasized in research over time, nor have researchers really tried to value the benefits associated with a lot of the interventions. And that's an important piece to understand when you think about the restricted fiscal environments that people operate in. It's also important to understand if you have identified a successful intervention, looking at the impacts, and then other districts across the country or states want to try and replicate those programs. Because in order to replicate them, you really need to understand how the implementation of the project went and what the resources were associated with that implementation. And looking at all the costs and resources that went into it are an important part of understanding the implementation. So IES, which oversees the regional labs, has recognized this, and in the past several years has really made an effort to emphasize and build more cost analyses into rigorous research. One of the ways they're doing that is supporting a center at Columbia University known as the Center for Benefit Cost Studies in Education. And they have provided training to researchers. Mark and I have both participated in that, to implement sort of a rigorous approach to costing out interventions and costing out the benefits of interventions. So some of the materials we have in this presentation actually come from some of the work of the Center for Benefit Cost Studies in Education. So with that, I think we will, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Mark to talk a little bit about the cost analysis approaches, the three approaches that we're going to be focused on today.
Okay, so as Dale mentioned, we're going to be looking at three of sort of four well-known cost analysis approaches. The three that we'll be discussing are cost effectiveness, cost feasibility, and cost benefit. The fourth approach, known as cost utility, won't be addressed in this webinar. And essentially, cost utility uses various methods for trying to quantify, in particular, benefits that may be difficult in the normal course of things to quantify or put a monetary value on. It's also used to assess the values that people may place on an alternative when that may not be obvious, or when there may not be any direct quantitative way to measure that. So we will not be discussing that. should also note that often these terms are used, particularly cost effectiveness and cost benefit are used interchangeably, but really they're very different studies that are used for different purposes. And so it's important as you get into this work to understand the differences between the 3 or 4 different approaches and the terminology used behind them. Each of these approaches is considered a valid approach, but are designed to accomplish very different things, which we shall see as we go through some of the examples that we have later on in the webinar. We could go to the next slide. So let's start with cost effectiveness analysis. Under this approach, we would use this to compare several different program alternatives. For example, your district may be looking at maybe 5 different alternative reading programs to purchase and implement. And you want to know which one is most effective, both in terms of producing improved student outcomes and costs. Say, reading Read 180 or Reading Recovery or Success for All. So you could use cost effectiveness to determine which of these alternatives are the most cost effective. When you're doing cost effectiveness analysis, you need to have a common outcome measure. So in our example of selecting a reading intervention, you would need either a common assessment that's been applied to the outcomes of the 3 or 4 or 5 different interventions, or at least you need to be able to equate them so that you have comparable measures. For example, you might use the reading portion of a state assessment or a district developed or teacher developed assessment. When you're doing this type of analysis, what you'll do is you'll combine both the outcome measures, so say the test scores or the improvement in graduation rates, with a detailed and robust cost analysis, so that you know exactly what the costs are for implementing and operating this program. Ultimately, what you hope to get out of the analysis is a ratio that is the cost per unit of improvement achieved. For example, you may have a program where for every $10 per student that you spend on the program, assessments have shown that students on average will make a 1 point gain in the scale score of whatever assessment you're using. We should also note that the most effective approach or program or alternative that you're looking at may not always be the most cost effective. So you may be able to get perhaps more improvement using one program, but because it's significantly more expensive, the cost per unit of improvement may be significantly more than another alternative. So what we're really doing is trying to look at which one is both effective cost-wise as well as in producing improved student outcomes. Okay. So this is our first little interactive session. Just to provide an example, so here we have 3 different programs that we're looking at in our hypothetical school district. They're all aimed at trying to improve reading scores. So program A costs $1,000 per pupil and will yield a 50-point gain on your MAP reading scores. Program B costs $2,000 per participant and will yield on average a 75-point gain on your MAP reading scores. And then we have program C, which costs approximately $500, so significantly less than the other 2 options, and yields, again, a smaller point gain of only 30 points on the MAP reading score. So in looking at this, based on what we've talked about so far, which of these programs would you think would be the most cost effective, and thus the program that you would recommend to your either your superintendent or your school board to purchase? And we'll go to the polling feature and you'll get a chance to indicate which of the programs you would select. We'll take a couple of minutes, or about a minute or so, to let you make your selection, and then we'll talk about how we did. question about who we're working with on this. And I think what the question is so we had mentioned that we've received training, and many of the materials that we're using here have been developed by the Center for Benefit Cost Analyses in Education, or Benefit Cost Studies in Education. And this is at Teachers College at Columbia University. It's under the direction of Dr. Henry Levin. So hopefully we answered that question. Okay, so it looks like most of the people that answered the question chose program C. And I'm just wondering if anyone would be willing to use the Q&A button to give us a brief rationale for why you chose program C. What is it about program C that would make you think it's the most cost-effective program among those three choices? Again, if you could use the Q&A button, we'll give you a little bit of time to think about that if you're willing to volunteer to put your rationale out there. One response saying that it has the lowest cost per student point gained. So someone did the math. We're happy to see that. So let's go on. Let's go on to the next slide, and we'll discuss exactly that.
Yeah, if we could advance to the next one.
Yeah, we're just not, doesn't seem like we're able to do that for some reason. It's indicating that we're in control of the screen, but we don't seem to be.
Yeah.
Okay, so which is the most cost effective? So if we look at program A at $1,000 for 50 points of gain, that comes to $20 per point gained. Program B with the whopping 75 points gained costs $27 per point gained. And then program C at a cost of $500 yields a 30-point gain, or $17 per point. So the correct answer was program C. That is the most cost-effective because it's the least expensive for every point gained on your reading scores. If money were no object and you were looking at the program that would just give you the greatest gains, then perhaps you'd want to recommend program B because it will yield a 75-point gain, which is more than twice program C, but it's also at a significantly higher cost. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of how, in looking at these alternatives for cost analyses, that it really depends a little bit on what your end game is as to which method you're going to choose.
We can go to the next slide.
All right. So cost effectiveness analysis has, as with most things, has some strengths and also some weaknesses. So among the strengths are that it can be, fairly easily integrated into a standard program evaluation. And of course, we would urge those of you who are working in program evaluation to do that, with the caveat that you need to make sure that part of your program evaluation, your evaluation design, would include the detailed cost study that you need. One thing that we've learned and others have learned over time is that it's very difficult to go back after the fact and try to accurately capture all of the details on costs and the amount of time people put in on the various activities. So it's much better to try to collect that data as the program is operating rather than after the fact. Also, it's very useful for comparing alternatives that either have a single or a small number of the same objectives. So in the last example, we were comparing programs that had the single objective of trying to improve reading scores. Among the weaknesses is that you do need that common outcome measure. So you wouldn't be able to compare the cost effectiveness of a math remediation program and a reading remediation program, because they're really two different types of outcomes and two different types of measures. It can be difficult to interpret results if there are multiple measures. So for instance, say in the last example, we weren't just looking at, say, an overall reading score, but we were looking at how each of the programs may have impacted the speed at which students read, their comprehension of what they're reading, and their vocabulary development. So we presumably would, for each one of those three options, we'd need to do three separate cost effectiveness analyses, which would give us a cost effectiveness ratio for three different things: the cost to speed, cost to comprehension, and cost to vocabulary. But it'd be much harder to determine what that means in trying to assess those three alternatives than just looking at the single overall reading score. Among the other weaknesses include it's not able to judge the overall worth of a single alternative. So it may tell you which is the most cost effective among those alternatives, but it won't tell you whether it's worth engaging in that strategy or that program to begin with. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. The next cost analysis approach we're going to look at is called cost feasibility, and this is probably the most straightforward and simple approach. And really what it's used for is to basically use cost as your primary, if not only, criteria for making a decision. So if you have a very hard budget limit, say $300,000, that you can't go over for purchasing some sort of intervention or program, then you could use cost feasibility to fairly straightforwardly eliminate any of those alternatives that you're considering that may cost more. So for instance, if you're looking at 4 programs and 2 of those cost more than $300,000, one is $400,000, the other $600,000, then those 2 would be jettisoned based on your $300,000 cost limit criteria. The strengths there is that it fairly simply allows you to rule out alternatives that are too expensive. But on the other hand, the weakness is that it really doesn't give you any assessment of how effective those programs are, whether either in overall effectiveness or in cost effectiveness. One way that you may be able to use this is, say you've got a large number of alternatives that you're looking at. Say you've got 8 or 9 or 10 alternatives. You may set a budget limit which will eliminate 4, 5, 6 of those, and then you could follow up with a cost effectiveness analysis on the remaining 4 or 5 alternatives to find out which would be the most effective among those remaining alternatives. Go on to the next one. And then finally, the last of the 3 approaches we're going to discuss today is cost-benefit analysis. And that's essentially used to identify both the costs and then a full range of benefits which the program or maybe multiple programs, related programs, would produce. So for instance, you may be looking at a program that improves graduation rates. Well, that program may do a number of different things. It may not only improve graduation rates of students, but it may have other benefits such as improving the retention of teachers or improving the learning environment of the school, and then also may have some longer term benefits such as improved life outcomes for the students participating in the program. An advantage of the cost-benefit analysis is that it doesn't require common measure. It's really the benefits are identified for the specific program or intervention that you're dealing with. And of course, you need to conduct, in addition to the determining what the outcomes or the outcome improvements are, you also need to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the costs. So you need to get a lot of details on exactly what it costs and what the resources are needed, both in terms of money and persons and materials to implement and operate the program. Like the cost effectiveness analysis, The outcome of, for the kind of the endpoint of the cost-benefit analysis is also a ratio known as the cost-benefit ratio, which is essentially the per participant or per student total benefits of the program divided by the per participant or per student costs of the program. Thus, if you have a ratio that's greater than 1, that means that your benefits are greater than the costs, and so the program may very well be worthwhile doing. We can go on to the next slide. So strengths of the cost-benefit analysis. So again, no common outcome measure is needed. The focus is solely on the costs and the values of the benefits of that particular program rather than comparing across. However, it can be used to compare multiple projects if you would do multiple cost-benefit analyses. So you could do cost-benefit analyses on, say, whether to implement teacher retention program, or to improve graduation rates, or to improve math scores, and compare the cost-benefit ratios for each one of those to determine which one might be most bang for the buck of the district. Cost-benefit analysis can also be used to judge the worth of that single project. So it basically is telling us, unlike cost effectiveness, which is telling us which is the most cost effective among a number of alternatives, the cost-benefit analysis tells us through that cost-benefit ratio whether it's worth doing the project at all. And then it also takes into consideration opportunity costs, and in this context, what we mean by opportunity costs would be sort of the implications of not adopting the project or the program, or taking whatever action you're considering. So for example, if you're looking at a program that might improve graduation rates, conversely, what the cost-benefit analysis could tell you is, well, what are the costs of not doing this, which obviously would be lower, perhaps lower or less robust life outcomes for the students that end up dropping out because there is not the graduation program in place to support them to graduate from high school. And then finally, it can help to identify and to value both long and short range benefits. So some benefits may accrue over the lifetime of a participant. Others may accrue immediately or within a short period of time, maybe 1 to 3 years, to the school district itself. All right. A couple of weaknesses. In particular, it can be difficult to place a dollar value or to monetize the relevant benefits. So if we know that doing, say, better in math leads to not only a higher odds of graduating from high school, but also higher odds of attending college. And we know that, but we also know that in general, people who attend college and graduate from high school have lifetime earnings that are higher than those who drop out of high school. But that can be very difficult to determine, because in most cases, that's going to probably take a long-term longitudinal study to look at, say, a treatment group of students who went through the program versus those who did not go through the program, and look at what the difference was not only in graduation and college going rates, but then also what happened to them over the course of the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, or maybe even their entire working life, so that we can determine whether they did in fact have higher earnings. Did they pay more in taxes as a benefit to state and local governments and the federal government? Did they have just better life outcomes in general? Also, because of the focus on identifying benefits that can be quantified and monetized, this approach tends to advantage those programs that will result in easily quantifiable benefits. So if you've got 3 or 4 different programs you're looking at, one seems like it'd be fairly straightforward for doing a cost-benefit analysis. The other ones, you're maybe scratching your heads on exactly how you're going to value and monetize those benefits. Well, the default action may be to look at the program that's more easily quantifiable. Go on to the next one.
We could take, if we could take a pause here before we do this hypothetical and just see if anyone has any questions. That was sort of the overview of the three approaches that we're talking about. We're gonna go through a few hypothetical examples, but if anybody has any questions about what we talked about so far, you can take a second and type those in, and we'll see if we can answer those.
Okay, we do have one question. We're not quite sure which slide this applies to, but it asks, what was the objective and who funded? We're not sure if that's a question related to kind of the overall cost-benefit analysis center or to one of the programs that we were using as an example. So it looks like we may not have any questions. So now I'll turn it over to Dale for the next several slides.
Okay, so we're going to use the polling feature again, and we're going to give you a hypothetical situation and ask you to pick which of the three methods that Mark just went through, cost effectiveness, cost benefit, or cost feasibility, that you would apply to answer the question. And then we can talk a little bit about, why folks made the choices they did. So the first one, the state of improvement, which we've determined is an actual place, is interested in increasing high school graduation rates statewide. State Department of Education officials are interested in several different programs. The cost of implementing each program is around $5 million. And what the department wants to determine is if implementing one of the programs will be worth that program's costs. So let's take a minute and think about that, and we'll put the poll up and make your choices. Okay, so hopefully if you can see the results, what we have are the folks that responded. The largest number, 45% chose cost benefit, 36% chose cost effectiveness, and 18% cost feasibility, which is interesting. And let's talk about some of these answers. The cost-benefit analysis, I think, is a valid choice to make in this, because what we specified was the department wants to determine if implementing one of the programs would be worth its cost. So probably the best way to answer that question, if you were looking at one of the alternatives and wanted to know if that one, that the benefits outweighed the cost, you would use a cost-benefit analysis. And the questionnaire is what your outcome measure would be. You use high school graduation, and you'd want to be thinking about things like career earnings tied to high school graduation, and whether those career earnings over time outweighed the cost of the program. Things like that would be part of the cost-benefit analysis. Now, on the other hand, the cost effectiveness, I think, is another interesting question and a way to address this question. Because if you did have a common outcome measure, and high school graduation is a common outcome measure, and the cost of each of these programs, you could try and look across the programs to see which one, if they all have the same cost of 5 million, which one produced the most graduates. If you had rigorous data from a research study that could show that, you might be able to look at the cost effectiveness across interventions. The key there again is that you want to have a rigorous approach where you have comparison group for each program, where you could actually screen out differences if it was implemented in different districts with different characteristics, so that you could be sure the difference in graduation rates was attributable to the program and not the specific characteristics of a district that was implementing it. And the cost feasibility side, you could, if the goal was to make sure that all the programs were under a certain cost, you could look at it that way. In this case, we kind of specified the cost of each program was 5 million. We didn't specify whether that was over or below a budget. But that's just walking through the different options here, and we'll just go on to the next hypothetical and see how folks respond.
All right, for our next scenario, the Nowhere County School Board is going to adopt a new reading intervention program for early elementary grades 1 through 5. The district has $300,000 to spend on an intervention, and the district's curriculum office is looking at 7 different interventions. However, price is the most important criteria to making a decision about which alternative intervention that the district will select. So again, we'll use the polling feature, give you some time to think about which of the 3 approaches might be best for making a recommendation to the Nowhere County School Board. All right, so at this point we have preliminary results, and it looks like 21% of respondents thought it was a cost effectiveness analysis, 75% of respondents thought it should be a cost feasibility analysis, and 4% thought a cost benefit analysis. Is there anyone out there who would be willing to share the reason behind selecting the approach that you did? If anyone's interested in sharing their reasoning, please use the question and answer button and type a short rationale. Okay, well, it looks like the vast majority of people responded with the answer that I think we would agree with, and that is that this probably the recommendation would best be made via a cost feasibility analysis, because really for the Nowhere County School Board, the $300,000 maximum budget for the intervention was really the key criteria. And even though the district's curriculum office may have been reviewing a number of different interventions, it doesn't really, at least in this scenario, we don't really specify that they were looking at which ones were most effective in terms of improving reading in grades 1 through 5 in the district. Again, if you had the 7 interventions and maybe 3 of them ended up costing more than $300,000, then after you've done the cost analysis, then you would drop them from consideration and look at the remaining 4. Now, certainly once you have those 4 identified as falling within your budget limit, you could do a cost effectiveness analysis to see which among those 4 alternatives might be the most cost effective in getting gains for the least costs per gain on a reading assessment. So let's move on to the next scenario. If we could go to the next slide, Joe.
Great. All right, so more creative names here. The Balderdash City Schools is adopting a new math textbook and curriculum for its elementary schools. The district will select from one of 4 different vendors that passed an initial screening. The district has the estimated cost of purchasing and implementing each of the 4 options and has data from both the vendors and external evaluations on each program's impact on student achievement. Which approach would you use? And we'll put the poll up again. And again, if anyone has comments or questions either on about this hypothetical or wants to explain why they made the choice they did, just use the Q&A box. Great. So the majority of folks, 67% chose cost effectiveness, 0% on cost feasibility, and 33% of those who answered chose cost benefit. And on this one, I think since we're really talking about trying to compare across 4 options, and because we have at least we know that there's a common target, which is around mathematics. Assuming that you could come up with a common outcome measure, which we would assume is probably some type of a math assessment, and that the evaluations that were done were rigorous and used a similar or common outcome measure, then really cost effectiveness, as most people selected, is probably the way to go, because you could actually compare across the 4 vendors and get a calculation for an outcome unit increase per dollar spent. And that would really help the school district then select from among the 4 different vendors. Now, if the school district wanted to zero in on one of them, they could do a cost benefit analysis with that information. But probably the most appropriate approach on this one is cost effectiveness. All right, we have one last hypothetical, and then we'll move on.
All right. In no-name public schools, they are examining ways to improve student writing, and they're looking at 3 different potential solutions. The first one is to reduce class sizes with an emphasis on more writing. So smaller class sizes, more one-on-one time with the teacher, more emphasis on writing. The second is to hire college students with strong writing skills to support instruction, presumably as one-on-one or small group tutors to work with students on writing. And the final option or strategy is to develop new writing courses for students that they would take in addition to their regular English classes. So we have these 3 choices. Presumably each one is going to have costs, and presumably we could somehow measure what the outcomes are from each of these approaches. So again, using the polling feature, why don't you give us your best guess on what the most appropriate approach is for conducting a cost analysis? And once again, if anyone is interested in sharing the rationale for your choice among the three approaches, please feel free to share that using the Q&A button, or if you have a question regarding this scenario. All right, so it looks like not quite half of you selected cost effectiveness, about 11% cost feasibility, and a little over 40% cost benefit analysis. And this is kind of a tough one. Could go a couple of different ways. But I think if you kind of think through the steps, so because the focus is on writing, presumably we'll have a common outcome measure, which could be some sort of writing assessment. Obviously, all of these are going to have costs that could be studied and quantified. And obviously we're comparing multiple alternatives. So I think this would be most likely, the recommendation could be based on a cost effectiveness analysis, meaning that we would look at again, the common assessment, writing assessment. We would look at the costs and compare them, and then come up with select the option that was most cost effectiveness, so had the best cost effectiveness ratio, or the least cost per point gained on whatever the writing assessment is. So let's move on to the next topic, where we're going to talk. It looks like we have a question. In practice, how often does a school district have access to rigorous information about the outcomes of a given set of programs under consideration? That's a good question, and it's certainly going to vary based on the particular intervention that you're looking at. Many vendors will provide their own in-house studies of the impact of these, which I suppose you may want to take with a grain of salt. But also, particularly, more well-known programs will often have external evaluators who will have looked at them and will have published the results in peer-reviewed journals, and done fairly rigorous assessments of the impact of these programs. You also have other sources of information, such as the Department of Education's What Works Clearinghouse. So again, it's really going to depend on how well known or how prevalent the alternative has been around, the intervention has been around, and whether people have found it, compelling enough to study. So it's going to depend, on the types of interventions you're looking at.
Okay, great. Now that we've kind of run through the three approaches, we wanted to talk about, regardless of which approach you use, how to look at assessing cost of an intervention. And what we're recommending, based on what researchers have done nationally, is using kind of a really consistent method that is known as the ingredients approach. And what this approach requires is really the best way of doing this is in real time, while you're evaluating or analyzing a program, not looking back in time after the intervention is already run, but to collect detailed descriptions of the intervention, and we'll talk about what the resource pieces are associated with that. And based on the detailed description, even looking at a program's logic model, what are all the resources that might be needed to execute the intervention, and then how can you assign reliable costs to each resource. Really the best way to do this, like I said, is to observe the intervention directly if it's possible. And sometimes it's not possible to do this if there aren't enough resources for the research or evaluation study to actually have researchers observe or attend at least parts of the intervention. For the study that we'll talk about a little bit later, that we conducted through Rel Central, we did have those resources, and that made it much more reliable that we could attend meetings and see what type of staff were involved, what was the time commitment of these people, and then start gathering information on salaries and things like that. It's also important to think about conducting what are called sensitivity analyses when you're looking at costs, so that you can, if you're gathering cost information, for instance, through interviews with participants, there might be a range of costs associated or a range of time commitment associated with a particular intervention. And you want to run a sensitivity analysis where you assume the highest amount of time is spent on a particular activity, lower amount of time on a particular activity, and kind of understand what the range is, and whether, depending on the high or the low, does that actually tip the program to being not cost effective or not cost beneficial using sensitivity analysis. And a lot of studies don't conduct those sensitivity analysis as part of their work. We'll go on to the next slide. So when we talk about an ingredients approach, we're really talking about the actual components that are required to operate any kind of an education intervention. And so in the district setting, first and foremost is always personnel. And that's where, if you have limited resources to study cost, you want to put a lot of your effort into looking at what are the personnel costs, because they tend to be 75% or more of the costs of most education interventions. And what you need is enough specificity of the type of staff that are being called upon to interact or spend time in the intervention, and what the qualifications of those staff members are, so that you can understand what the salary and benefits are associated with each type of staff member. And it's not just teachers. You want to think about administrators who are required to oversee the project, coaches, support staff, substitute teachers, things like that. And oftentimes districts don't necessarily consider all these costs when they're thinking about an intervention. If they have to purchase something from a vendor, sometimes they might just think of what the purchase cost was for purchasing an intervention, and don't necessarily cost out all the associated trainings or meetings or planning that personnel actually have to undertake to implement the intervention. And those kind of costs really should be considered if you want to have a complete, robust comparison. So personnel is obviously number one. Facilities, and you'll see later when we talk about the real world study we did, if you really want to take into account all the costs, you want to understand what the facilities costs are over time, if there's a lot of meeting space used, or if there's even cleaning and things like that have to happen that would ordinarily have happened without the intervention. Equipment and materials, which could include technology or printing costs. In-kind inputs could be for volunteers or things like that, where if you wanted to actually take into account the time volunteers put in to participate in an intervention, that could be an in-kind input. And opportunity costs that Mark talked about earlier. If there are other ways that people could have been spending their time, for instance, you might want to consider those as opportunity costs for implementing a particular intervention. So really the key things to talk about is and to focus on here when conducting this kind of research is to, if possible, to observe the intervention in real time and be able to keep track of all the assumptions that are being made about staffing and other costs, and to kind of document the cost information you're gathering. Next slide.
Okay, and as we noted before when we were talking about cost-benefit analysis, we said that you're not only interested in identifying and quantifying the costs at some level of detail, but you also need to identify and value the benefits that may result from the intervention or the program or the project or whatever it is. These benefits may be long-term or short-term. So for example, if you implement a program for reducing teacher turnover, you may have some short-term benefits that you may see immediately or within a 1 or 2 or 3 year period that reduces some of your human resources costs. So if you have fewer teachers that are turning over, that are leaving the district in any given year, that's going to reduce the cost to the district of having to advertise and process applicants for the teacher position to get them into the system once they're hired, provide induction services so that the teacher knows sort of what the curricula are that are being used, all the various things that occur in inducting a new instructor, a new teacher into a school district. So those would be examples of short-term benefits, and they're fairly straightforward and probably could be very easily measured and quantified locally at the district. But then you may have some other teacher retention benefits, such as increased productivity. In the case of a teacher, increased productivity more often than not means that the teacher's instructional ability has improved. They have higher quality instruction. So that higher quality instruction may lead to better student outcomes. Kids do better on assessments. They're more likely to stay in school and graduate from high school. And depending on just how much better they did, they may be more inclined to attend college either for a few credits or perhaps to go on and get an associate's degree, a master's degree, or so on. So, and then those types of outcomes lead to other types of outcomes that for instance, that lead to better life outcomes for these kids. So because they did better in high school, graduated from high school, attended college, they're more than likely going to have higher lifetime earnings, which means they're going to pay more in taxes, which is good for state, local, and federal governments, and may have engaged in lower social spending. So they've had less need to, say, access welfare programs, subsidized health care, probably a lower chance of having been engaged in the criminal justice system because they were involved in a crime. And also we know that more highly educated people tend to have better health, so there may also be a benefit to just lower overall health spending in the system. So those are two of the differences between sort of short-term and long-term benefits. The monetizing or putting some sort of a dollar value on these benefits can be complex and can take fairly sophisticated longitudinal studies. If we go on to the next. All right. So how do we go about valuing these benefits? Well, there are three sort of common approaches to doing this. The first one may be by conducting an experimental or quasi-experimental or correlational study. So by an experimental or quasi-experimental, by an experimental study, let's stay with that, generally means that you may have a group of students who are randomly assigned to a treatment group, so they're actually going to participate in whatever the program or intervention is. And then you have a group of students that are randomly assigned to a control group, and they will not receive whatever the intervention or program is. Quasi-experimental basically are using other types of statistical approaches to approximate an experimental study if you're not able to actually do an experimental study on the ground. And a correlational study is just a more simple, say, a regression that looks at a correlational relationship between, say, an intervention and an outcome. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of trying to value benefits is to think about or to ask individuals how much they're willing to pay for that benefit. So if their students engage in some sort of intervention, what is that worth to the parents if they were required to pay for that? A third way, the final way of approaching this valuation of benefits is to look at, well, are there either instances where this impacts something in the marketplace, or is there some similar comparable service that's available in the marketplace and that's priced? So if you have a comparable similar service provided in the marketplace, well, then we can say, well, we guess that the price that people are paying for that would be a good approximation for the service or intervention we're providing in the schools for free. But in reality, in most cases, we will probably rely on the research of other researchers who have more expertise in doing these types of studies to help provide estimates of the value of these benefits. We go on to the next slide. So let's look at a couple of more specific examples that sort of go in the same order of what we just discussed. So an example of an experimental study would be, say, a longitudinal study that looks at, again, participants in a vocational training program. So again, we have a certain number of participants that were randomly assigned to the vocational program, and then we're going to track a number of students or participants who did not participate in the vocational training program. And we're going to look at what happens to them over a long period of time. We may want to check in every so many years to see what's happening. So you may want to look at, what happened to the two groups after 5 years, after 10 years, after 15 years. We could go all the way through retirement. And we want to then look at, okay, what is the difference between the two groups, those who were in the vocational training program and those who were not? What is the difference in their earnings? What about other life outcomes? Did one group have statistically significant better health outcomes than the other group? Did one group pay more in taxes? Did one group or another have less involvement with the criminal justice program? In terms of surveying individuals, an example of that could be by surveying individuals, you would look at perhaps ask them questions on their willingness to pay for the benefits. So that could include surveying low-income parents of preschool children and asking them, well, if you had the funds available, what would it be worth to you? What would you be willing to pay so that your kids could attend a high-quality full-day preschool program? That'd be another way of trying to estimate, well, this is the value of that benefit, at least to this particular population of parents. And then finally, there have been a number of studies that have looked at what impact the quality of schools in a neighborhood may have on home values in that neighborhood. And so you could look at, if you're trying to get an idea of what does the marketplace say about the value of this benefit. Well, one way of perhaps valuing the value or monetizing the value of higher quality schools would be to look at the value of homes in a neighborhood served by higher quality schools versus a neighborhood served by less effective schools. So those give you a sense of how those three benefit valuing approaches might actually look in a real life study. Let's go on to the next one. All right, so we're going to we know we've been throwing a lot of information at you over the last about an hour now. So we're going to just do a quick summary of what we've covered so far. So overall, cost effectiveness or cost benefit analysis, or any type of cost analysis really, is missing from the vast majority of educational evaluation studies. It's just something that most researchers to this point have not been interested in looking at. However, we do know that in many cases, it's becoming more important, and certainly IES has certainly thought that's more important, that as we sort of have higher expectations with less resources, that it's important to look at both the impact side and the cost side of any intervention or program. The three cost analyses that at least we've made the determination that we think would be probably most useful to states and school districts are cost effectiveness, cost feasibility, and cost benefit. And we use, obviously, cost effectiveness to compare sort of a ratio of unit of improvement in an outcome to the cost, requiring a common outcome measure, and basically then selecting among those options the one that has the least cost for each unit of improvement. Cost feasibility is that very straightforward analysis of looking at what are the total costs, and do those total costs exceed what we have available in the budget to pay for a program or an intervention, and if it does, then we obviously can't select that option. we have to look at options that stay within our budget. Next slide. And then finally, cost-benefit analysis that kind of answers the big question of whether it's worth doing whatever it is we're looking at doing at all. And that looks at doing a very comprehensive and detailed look at both the value of the costs, so the total quantifiable amount of the costs, as well as the measurable benefits that we've been able to identify and put dollar signs to. And then to the extent that the total benefits exceed the total costs, then it may make sense to actually move forward and do whatever that is we're looking at doing. All of these methods require a detailed accounting of implementation and operations costs, which we're calling the ingredients approach, which was developed largely by Levin's shop at Teachers College. Cost-benefit analysis, as we discussed, also requires fairly sophisticated and complex valuing of the benefits that we've observed. And a lot of times this is sort of a two-stage process whereby the benefits may be, the immediate benefits may be higher graduation rates or better scores on reading or math tests, but in the long run, those better scores or higher graduation rates may lead to other benefits accruing to the individual or to society down the road, such as better health, better earnings, fewer government programs tapped. Go on to the next.
So what we've been talking about up until this point is sort of the theoretical underpinnings of cost analysis in education studies. And what we want to move on now is to a real world example that was just completed of an actual study that was done in a district in Colorado. If anybody has any questions up until this point, please, again, put them in the Q&A and we'll try and answer those. But the study you see on the screen now was published earlier this year and focused on a program that was developed in a school district in Colorado called Aurora Public Schools, which is one of the larger urban districts in the state. And what they were interested in was sort of a new approach to mentoring teachers that we use recently retired master educators. People had worked in the district for quite a while. And one of the motivations of the district for doing this was around cost. They were seeing a lot of teacher turnover, as we'll talk about, and we're really looking for to find, cost-efficient ways of supporting new teachers who they were trying to keep. And the thought was, maybe using retired educators who you don't have to pull out of a classroom while paying a full salary with benefits could be an effective way of supporting new teachers without the full cost of taking a current teacher out of the classroom. So we'll talk a little bit about how we actually did this. So we'll go to the next slide. So just a little bit about the study. This was what they call making an impact study for IES, and was a 2-year randomized controlled trial study, which was conducted in the 2013-14 and 14-15 school years. And we had 77 classroom teachers in 11 schools. And within each school, half of the teachers, the new teachers, were randomly assigned to a control group or a treatment group. And the control group received the district's business as usual mentoring program. And these were teachers in their first 3 years at the district. And the treatment group was assigned to a retired mentor. All the schools that participated were Title I schools with approximately 90% free and reduced lunch, and had very high rates of teacher turnover and had persistent student performance challenges. So what the goal was really to compare the impacts on the new teachers that received support from retired educators with those teachers who were just receiving the business as usual support. And I'll talk a little bit about what those look like. So we go to the next slide. This is a sort of a shot of the logic model behind the program. And I mentioned the logic model before as just a way of helping when you're thinking about doing cost analysis. The logic model can kind of help in several ways. The first block there, thinking about the current situation, the need diagnosis. For Aurora Public Schools, the needs are around supporting probationary teachers so they can be more effective, retaining teachers, dealing with teacher turnover, and really trying to do something to improve student performance. Those kind of need pieces can also help you identify where you want to focus your outcomes, and which outcomes are the most important to measure. And then, of course, the middle box, the major intervention components, that gives you an idea of where you should be looking at program costs, tracking costs. So, in this case, they're pairing probationary teachers in high-need schools with master retired educators over 2 years. There was a summer professional development component, and this emphasis on individualized mentoring and support in the classroom. All those suggest cost components that we had to consider when we were evaluating the program. Let's go to the next slide. So just so you an understanding of the different sort of resources involved, also the business as usual program for the district was sort of what you might see in many districts called a buddy mentor program, which was really a one-year program. There was no selection process for the mentor. It was sort of teachers willing to do it who volunteered in the building. Really no training or classroom release time provided for the mentor in order to work with the mentee. So there was no expectation that the mentors would be observing the mentee's instruction. Really, it was just sort of a minimum expectation of about 15 hours of meeting over the course of the year, and the mentor received a $500 stipend for that. The treatment of the intervention, in contrast, used these retired mentors. It was a 2-year program, and they had sort of rigorous selection criteria for the mentors. Mentors had to have evidence of success in the district, working in high-need schools. They had to go through an interview process, had to have at least 5 years teaching in the district. Most had around 20. And for those who were selected as retired mentors for the program, they had to participate in training. They had to be available to meet with teachers before, during, and after school. There was an expectation for at least an hour and a half a week of meeting with mentors and actual observation in the classroom. And they could use a mix of taking their mentees to model classrooms to do observations. They could do co-teaching. And the mentors received a pay of, on average, $42.50 an hour. Next slide. So as we looked at the program logic model, and you think about the key outcomes that the district was focused on, the randomized controlled trial that we designed basically had 3 key outcomes. The first was student achievement, and we focused on both reading and math. The district used the NWEA MAP assessment in elementary school, and all these schools were at the elementary level. And so the students who were students of the treatment group teachers and students who were with the control group teachers were assessed in fall and spring, both years, in reading and math to understand what the differences were in achievement. That was a major outcome measure. Teacher evaluation scores, we used the district's own rubric, which was administered by principals and school leaders each year. That was used to evaluate teacher performance across, I think, 11 different factors that the district had identified. And finally, teacher retention, which was a significant concern for the district. And this was measured from the district's HR, Human Resources Department, which gave us figures at the start of each new school year for which teachers had remained in the school district. So the 3 kind of basic steps that we used, and this aligns with what we've talked about up until this point, to doing a cost-benefit analysis of this program was to make sure we collected detailed data on program costs in real time. So our researchers were able to actually attend meetings of the mentor team, to observe mentors working with mentees, to meet several times a year with the district grants office personnel. The grants office was overseeing the program to see what did it actually take to administer the program, to keep track of all the timesheets that mentors were submitting, to plan meetings and meeting space, things like that. To collect impact data on teachers and students, and we just talked about the three measures we used on impact, and then to, using both of those pieces, determine the value of benefits to teachers or students. Okay, next slide. So real quick, we could just, if folks want to write in, or just think on your own, what costs you think would be associated with this program, and what benefits and associated dollar savings might be expected. Feel free to write those into the Q&A, or just to think about it on your own, and I can talk through some of them. The more obvious costs, as we thought about this and collaborating with the district, was obviously things like mentor time and pay. And the district provided us all the time cards and things like that for that mentors spent. But we had to also consider some of the less obvious costs. Mentors meeting at in a team several times each semester. Where did they meet? What space was used? What materials were provided at the meetings? Each of the mentor team meetings involved the district head of professional development, who was training the mentors to make sure that they stayed on top of any new developments in the district. So that required that person's time. And even though they're a salaried employee of the district, we wanted to track, what amount of time did they have to invest in training the mentors. We talked about substitute teacher time for the mentees to go visit classrooms, model classrooms with their mentors. And really trying to think of all those costs as part of the cost of the program, so that we could say we did a very rigorous and thorough job of determining not just what the district had set aside in its budget, because the district did have had title money set aside to do this, but what all the staffing costs were associated with those, and materials and space and things like that. So again, this just lists through some of the things that I just talked about. We looked at mentor pay and mentee stipends for meeting with mentors before and after school, and all the costs associated with program administration. And then what we did is we summed those up and kind of came up with a per mentee cost. And we knew the local cost to the district because we met regularly with the grants office, and we knew exactly what they were paying folks, what the salaries were. But we also wanted to consider, if this study was published nationally, a district in a different state that wanted to implement this program, the prices might be different in Colorado than in other places. So we used a national database to convert local costs into national prices, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's sort of important in terms of the replicability of the program in other places. Okay. So once we had a kind of firm understanding of costs, we had to make sure that we were also understanding the benefits. And as I said before, our three kind of key areas were looking at teacher retention rates, teacher evaluation ratings, and student achievement. And like, as I said before, a key thing that we did in this study, and that IES kind of requires, is that you focus only on impact findings that are the most rigorous. So even though we had some suggestive research findings in some of these areas that I'll talk about, we really wanted to focus on the ones that we could say were causal, that were shown by the randomized control study to really be a causal effect of the intervention. Next slide. So as we said, one of the benefits that we were looking to measure was around teacher retention. And there's a lot of research out there that talks about how expensive it is to replace a teacher, and it ranges from anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000 a teacher, based, depending on the size and location of a district. But what we do know is teacher retention has huge costs nationally. in some estimates in the $5 billion range. In this study, we didn't have a statistically significant effect when we look at the end of the 2 years on retention. Although, as we'll see in the next slide, there was evidence that the more hours of mentoring that teachers received, the more likely they were to stay in the district. And we'll see that in the next slide. And what this shows is that the more hours of mentoring, you can see the curve kind of going that mentees received sort of increased their chances of staying in the district. In fact, the odds of a mentee staying in the district doubled with every additional 10 hours of mentoring received, and even one additional hour increased the odds of a teacher staying in the district by around 12%. But since these findings were not causal, because these findings were really only focused on the group of teachers that received the intervention, we did not cost out those benefits. In the cost-benefit analysis, we excluded it. We only wanted to focus on things where there was a clear causal effect. Let's go on to the next one. Teacher evaluation was the second, and we looked at the ratings from the teacher evaluation scores, and again, there wasn't a significant relationship found between the program and the improved evaluation, so we didn't try and cost those benefits out either. Next slide. Student achievement, however, we did find a significant impact on student math scores after 1 year for students in the treatment group. And so what we were able to do is then take a look at literature, and there's a national study that actually links the impact of increased math achievement associated with just a single year of instruction that could be linked directly to increases in lifetime earnings and other social gains, including reductions in teen pregnancy and improved graduation rates. What we focused on, because we had a rigorous study that showed an increase in lifetime earnings, was that piece. And this external study had looked longitudinally at the impacts on a single year of gain in math to higher lifetime earnings. And even though we couldn't really cost out some of these other benefits like reductions in teen pregnancy and things like that, we decided, let's focus on what the difference in lifetime earnings associated with improved math achievement might mean in terms of an overall cost benefit.
All right, and so this is sort of the key table to the whole study. So as we totaled up all the costs that Dale talked about, and then also the value of these various benefits, and then rather than taking them on a per mentee basis, we calculated a per student amount for both the benefits and the costs. And as Dale mentioned, we did this using both local pricing, which used the actual school district salaries and costs for other things, as well as the national pricing from the database that the Center for Benefit Cost Studies in Education has put together over the last number of years. And as you can see, the national pricing is somewhat higher. So the first line is cost per student, 173 for local pricing, 239 for national. Then we figured out the federal fiscal benefits, so that includes for those students that with higher earnings, they paid higher federal income taxes, they participated in fewer federal social support programs and that sort of thing. And obviously the benefits were costed using the same prices. And again, I think both of these studies were also conducted by Henry Levin and Clive Bellafield at the Center for Benefit Cost Studies in Education. And the costs do not vary between local and national pricing. The bottom line is sort of the key piece. So what we found is that for every dollar spent on the program under local pricing, the benefits accrued to about $6.32. So a fairly significant cost-benefit ratio. A little bit lower for national pricing because the costs were higher while the benefits stayed the same. Next slide. We also wanted to talk just really briefly. We wanted to look around at other research that might help verify the results that we found. And there was a study that we found that was conducted by Chetty, Friedman, and Rakoff in 2011 where they did a somewhat similar study where they were looking more at the improvement in teacher effectiveness and what kind of impact that had over the lifetime of the more effective students. And eventually what they found is that there was a combined increase in yearly lifetime earnings of nearly $2 million across those students, and that over time, the cost of the program was exceeded by the lifetime earnings alone by more than 15 times or more.
Okay. And I think, you know, the last slide here, and then we wanted to leave a little bit of time. I think we're pretty much out of time but, for questions. But, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the return actually could be higher if we could quantify some of the other benefits associated with this intervention, such as increased probability of attending college, which the Chetty research found, or the reduced probability of teenage births and things like that. But we weren't able to do that. So what we did is sort of use only the most rigorous approach where we could actually price out the benefits. And even with that, we found that the cost benefit of this particular intervention seemed to be positive. So I think with that, we'll go to, if there are any questions that folks want to ask. And we really appreciate everybody participating and taking our polls today and listening in. And we've got our email addresses up here. If you want to email us questions directly, we'd be happy to try and address those.
And we also list a couple of resources, because we know this is sort of a 30,000-foot introduction to the whole concept. So if you want to learn more, there are a couple of resources that we've provided there. We do have one question if we have time to answer that, and it's for costs. Are you measuring total or marginal costs of resources, for example, of teacher time or space costs? So what we're measuring are the actual costs of the teacher dedicated, or any staff person, the actual cost dedicated to the program. So if you had a teacher, you know, if you figure 100% of their time, and they dedicated, you know, 1% of their time over the course of the year to the program, then we would take that prorated 1% of total cost that'd be there, both their salary and benefits. Same for space. So if they used space, well, I guess you'd look at space costs a couple of different ways. If they had to rent space, then we would just use the cost of the rent paid for the meetings. If it was district provided space, then again, it's a fairly complicated procedure, but we would look at, okay, what was the total square footage of the room? What is the cost on average of square foot construction for a room of that sort? And then sort of how much time did they use over the expected length, useful life of that building? So you might be talking about comparing several hours to 30 years of time. So we did try to capture just those costs of things directly contributing to the program itself.
Thank you very much for participating. And again, if there are any other questions, please feel free to email us, and we'll be happy to answer them. And I think with that, we will adjourn since there are no other questions. Again, we appreciate everybody's participation. And thank you very much.
Thank you for participating.